Hey class, welcome to lecture number 2. And in this lecture today we're going to be talking a little bit about evaluating sources. To start, I want to share with you a little story that comes from my own personal experiences when I was in graduate school. When I was in graduate school, I was in a class on race and representation. And for that class, I had to do a project in which I explored old archives and recreate a story about somebody from the past. So I started doing some research, and I came across in the Library of Congress, they have a collection from, they call them the slave narratives. And it's a collection that were compiled during the Great Depression. So what had happened in the 1930s, as the United States is in the midst of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt, FDR, creates a whole bunch of new programs as a way of stimulating the economy, giving people employment, trying to save the country. And so this was the era of big government. And one of the programs that FDR created was called the Federal Writers Project. And this was roughly between 1935, 36, and 1938, 39. What was happening during the Great Depression is that everybody lost work. And FDR created all sorts of these little programs that hired different groups of people. Well, the Federal Writers Project was aimed specifically at writers, those who wrote fiction, nonfiction, those who wrote poetry, those who wrote music or musicals. It opened the doors to just about anybody with a writing background. And one of the projects that this group did was they traveled throughout the country and looking for people who had lived during slavery or who had been slaves prior to the abolition of slavery in 1863 or 1865. And so this group of writers traveled organizing in Washington, D.C., travels south into Alabama and Mississippi, but also north into Chicago, looking for people, mind you, this is in the late 1930s, who had lived as a slave. So if they had lived as a slave, that means they had been a slave in the 1850s and 60s. So here we are some 60 or 70 years later, interviewing these same people for their experiences. Now, I thought this was a gold mine because here we have primary sources. These are people who had experienced slavery themselves, who are being asked about their experiences, who had lived it, who remembered it, and here 60 or 70 years later, were able to tell their story to another person. And I started going through all of these documents, and there are hundreds of them, and they're organized by location, and I was reading through them and just was blown away by the power. And most of these people are old. I remember one lady claimed to be over 120 years old. And so she had experienced slavery as a young girl and as a woman and had lived kind of throughout the rest of her life clearly as a free woman. But as I spent more time thinking about these sources and thinking about evaluating them, and trying to determine just how reliable these sources are, there were a couple of immediate flags that I needed to contend with. Well, the first obvious one has to do with the amount of time that had passed. Look, I'm 40 years old. I don't remember much about my 20s. I don't remember much about my teens. Those were 20 or 30 years ago. I could tell you some stories about the past, but I can't tell you what happened every single day. If you asked me what my life was like when I was in college, I can talk about it in broad terms. But even things like where my apartments were and who my roommates were. Okay, I can remember my roommates. What classes I took, I couldn't tell you what my class lists were from semester to semester. I couldn't tell you the names of my professors. I couldn't even tell you the type of assignments that I did. Right? And that's just 20 or 30 years. Imagine 60 years have passed. Time has a way of graying out our past. We have a way of remembering the worst experiences, and some of the best experiences, but a lot of the everything, everyday type of monotony we tend to forget. But we also have a way of rethinking about the past so that even our worst experiences aren't seen as bad as we thought of them in the present. So one red flag was the amount of time that had passed and questions about reliability. Second, when telling stories about ourselves, we have a tendency, I think it's just part of human nature, to want to exaggerate things. If your goal is to explain how tragic slavery was, well, in retelling that story, wouldn't you focus only on the tragedy? And would you not maybe exaggerate details to make your point that slavery was terrible? Maybe instead of the one lash that you received, maybe you say it was 5. And I'm not calling people liars. I'm saying these are areas where question marks that we have about the reliability of sources. But there were other factors here too. Think about the context in which the interview was given. Here you have, in some cases, you have a white interviewer from the north who has traveled and has identified, found this man or this woman who had lived as a slave, knocked on their door, and said, "Hey, I want to ask you some questions." Might you have some initial hesitancy? Might you be afraid of telling the whole truth because you're not sure exactly why this person was there and how this information would be used? Do you think your story would be different, or the things that you focused on would be different if the person asking you questions came from the same background, the same race as you did? So would the interviews be different if it was conducted by an African American, by a Black American, or a white American? And as I thought about those questions, I thought, yeah, absolutely, that would be different, right? Because once we get into the psychology of the individual, the various anxieties and concerns, the worries that they might have, then yeah, that could very well impact not just the reliability of the story or of the narrative, but also what they choose to talk about. So today in our materials or our lectures for this lecture number 2, we're going to be focusing on evaluating sources and asking those important questions about reliability. So this builds off of our last lecture, in which we talked largely about the lunchroom fight and what sources, here's the context, what sources are reliable and which ones might not be. So some things that I want you to remember. First, perspectives on what happened can vary, and it matters when and why a person is telling the story. Historians have to think carefully about these things when they're deciding whether a source is strong evidence of what actually happened, or whether this is weak evidence, problematic evidence. Some sources offer really strong evidence, while others aren't good evidence at all. And more often, a historian finds sources that offer some evidence, but also have some limitations. Some reasons why it may be inaccurate or incomplete. So today, what we'll be working on is I'm going to have you consider 5 historical sources, and your job will be to think about these sources and think about them like a historian, and try to identify the strengths and limitations of each source. In other words, I want you to think about how each source could provide evidence, to help answer a historical question, and also why each source might not provide accurate information about the past. So what you'll find below are maybe some worksheets that I'm going to have you go through and answer some questions about.